This is the weapon of a Jedi Knight, not as clumsy or random as a blaster, an elegant weapon for a more civilized age.
Call it what it is, man. It's a freaking laser sword. Hello and welcome to another episode of Magic 101. Today, we're going to talk about one of the coolest spells in the entire series, and one of my personal favorites, because it's a laser sword. It's objectively cool. Ensis Exequens, or the Executioner's Sword, is a high-level ice spell used by Evangeline, and literally every single part of that sentence is worth discussing.
So what does the spell actually do?
The mage extends their fingers and gathers up a massive amount of energy in their hand. Their fingertips emit light and heat, which the mage then forms into a blade. It's kind of like Vegeto's Spirit Sword from Dragon Ball Z, except that the Spirit Sword isn't really fundamentally different from any other ki attack. It's essentially just a sharp Kamehameha wave. You can't really say the same for Ensis Exequens.
It really stands on its own.
I really need to stress, this is a very, very advanced spell. There are literally only 2 characters in the whole series who can perform it. Though there may be other reasons for that, but I'll get into that later. That might come as a bit of a surprise to some of you. Even though laser swords are objectively cool, they are relatively common in fiction. Hence the joke at the beginning of the video. So in a world where magic exists, you might think summoning a laser sword from your hand would just be a slightly rarer than normal ability. But trust me, this spell is much more complex than it seems at first glance. It can be used as a regular sword, of course, but the blade is pretty unique. First of all, the energy doesn't come directly from the mage's body. The heat comes out of the surrounding environment. That's what makes this an ice spell. And yes, it is an ice spell, despite the fact that it really seems like it should be a fire spell. In general, ice magic drains the heat out of water, or the moisture in the air, to freeze it. It's not complicated. Water minus heat equals ice. That's how most ice spells work. But Ensis Exequens takes that concept to a whole new level. Instead of, I assume, absorbing the heat into the mage's body, or like sending it to the Shadow Realm or whatever, it harnesses that energy for the sword. It's actually a two-pronged attack, because even if the opponent dodges the blade, they would still have to deal with the intense cold in the spell's wake. This never really comes up in Nejima, you just kind of have to know it from outside sources. But if you look really closely at this fight from Yuki Holder, when Eva stabs Baal with it, the area around the cut actually starts freezing, like it's draining the heat from its target to fuel the blade. Which, now that I think about it, should stop the wounds from healing too. This is why the spell is so advanced. She has to contain all that heat so she doesn't hurt herself or anyone else other than her intended target. Manipulating temperature so precisely in such a small area is well beyond the skill level of most mages, and probably puts Ensis Exequens second only to Cosmic Catastrophe as the highest level ice spell. But it doesn't just cut opponents to do damage. The heat of the blade is so intense that it instantly vaporizes things on contact. Think back to 6th grade chemistry. When a solid object gets too hot, it becomes liquid, a process called melting. And when liquid gets too hot, it becomes a gas, which we call boiling. But Ensis Exequens is so hot, it doesn't just melt or boil, it sublimates, causing objects to go straight from solid to gas without passing through a liquid state. Obviously, people don't just explode when the sword touches them. That would be ridiculous. Fate even grabbed it with his bare hands at one point. But according to the Nejima wiki, this is actually how it works. I assume the only reason it's not an instant kill move is because the other person can protect themselves with magic. Cause none of the guys we ever see get hit by it are weaklings. It's top tier fighters like Fate or Baal. They could also just be holding back their power so they don't kill people. But I imagine if they ever stabbed a rock or a tree with it, it would just get vaporized. There's also the fact that Neji calls his version imperfect, so he may not have mastered it just yet. This isn't stated in the series anywhere, but in my opinion, it is very likely that Evangeline created this spell herself. But I don't mean to present my own opinions as if it's fact, so let's look at the evidence. First of all, she uses the spell all the time, with no hesitation and no effort at all. You could consider it her signature spell, whether she invented it or not. That alone wouldn't be enough to prove she created it. After all, Neji has a lot of signature spells we know for a fact he didn't create. But I do think she's one of the only mages that could have developed a spell like this. As I said earlier, this is a very high level ice spell, and Evangeline is the best ice mage in the series. I don't think too many people would disagree with me about that. And we know she can make high level ice spells from scratch, because she made Endless White Nine Heavens, arguably the most powerful and complex ice spell in the franchise. I know, I've mentioned it before, and I promise to do a video about it sometime in the future. But considering that she made that, I don't think it's too outlandish to think that she could have made Ensis Exequens as well. Also, remember when I said that only 2 other people could use it? That's a really big deal. Almost no other spell is that exclusive. The only exceptions are all the spells that Neji developed himself over the course of the series, like the Thunder God Spear, Spell Synthesis, and so on. Magia Erebia and Endless White Nine Heavens, which were made by Eva, and Ensis Exequens. That's a rather specific exclusion, don't you think? And the only other person that can use it is Neji, who trained with her for about 8 months and probably saw her use it a dozen times. Even if she didn't teach him directly, as the story tells us multiple times, Neji is a magical genius and learns new skills extremely fast. So I think he could pick it up given enough time. This is even sort of implied when Eva sees him use it in her magic scroll, because she takes it as a sign that he's going to follow in her footsteps. I know I kinda talk up Eva a lot in these videos, but honestly she deserves it. Remember all the stuff I said about how difficult this spell is? How you have to control such a large amount of energy in such a small area? Well, imagine how much more difficult it would be to invent it. It's like learning to drive versus building your own car. Totally different thing. Even if she didn't make it, she's definitely the most skilled user. In fact, let's compare her use to Neji's. The first time he used it, he calls it imperfect. And if you look closely, it doesn't really seem like he can form the blade properly yet. Although it might just look blurry because it's in motion. And to his credit, after this, he never calls it imperfect again. And after that, the blade does have a defined shape. At this point, he seems to have no problems wielding it like a normal sword. He never vaporized anything with it. But like I already mentioned, that doesn't necessarily mean that he doesn't know how to. It could be due to his opponent's magical resistance, or he could be holding back to avoid killing them. Now let's look at Eva. First of all, she can do everything that Neji can do with it, but she can also use 2 blades at once, even when she was younger. For example, this scene is from a flashback to the year 1518, almost 500 years before Nejima starts. She can also freely control its size and shape. She has made it anything from a small dagger that extends just past her fingertips to a massive sword the size of a building. She can even create multiple small blades on a single hand. Considering how difficult this spell is to perform, the fact that she can control it this well is nothing short of incredible. She also just seems really comfortable using it in general. She pulls it out like it's second nature to her. Even when she's extremely pissed off, she has no problem controlling it. And it takes no time at all. Probably helped by the fact that Ensis Exequens doesn't have a full incantation. Eva and Neji usually don't say anything. At most, they'll just say Ensis Exequens, but that's all. Maybe they've both mastered it to the point where they don't need the incantation, but as I said before, when Neji used it, it was imperfect, and he still didn't have to chant. And it seems a bit too strong for you to just be able to skip the incantation. I think it was designed without an incantation in the first place, which makes sense. It's a quick, short-range spell. If it did have a long incantation, it would be a lot less practical. But I think that about does it for Ensis Exequens. It's definitely one of the more interesting spells in Negima that unfortunately doesn't get shown off too much, so I really want to shine a spotlight on it in this video. If there are any spells you want me to cover in the future, be sure to let me know in the comments below. I'd also recommend clicking that subscribe button and that little bell icon so YouTube actually shows it to you when I do get around to making them. Until then, remember, a little bit of courage is the real magic.